Welcome to Seattle Voices. I'm Eric Liu. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Gloria Burgess, who is the author of Legacy Living and also the principal of a firm called Jazz Inc. And we're going to hear a whole lot more about Jazz Inc. Gloria, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
First, tell me about Jazz Inc., then we're going to talk about the book. What is Jazz Inc.?
Jazz Inc. Jazz Incorporated is my consulting company. I have done leadership development, coaching, and consulting for the last 14, 15 years. And jazz is a metaphor that I use to help people understand that they're already creative, they're already an expert in what they do, and sometimes they forget the music. And my job is to help them remember. So.
And how do you go about doing that, helping them remember this?
Well, in all kinds of ways, Eric. Like I said, the focus is leadership development. So sometimes I focus on their particular performance issues in a workplace. So maybe there's a business situation where they want higher performance with their team or with themselves, and I come and work with the individual or the team or an entire organization. Sometimes it may take the form of strategic planning or visioning to imagine what they want to be 5 or 10 years or maybe even 25 years down the road. So it takes various forms.
Now, one of the things we were wrestling with before the camera started rolling was just how to identify you, because you're a poet, you're a musician, you're an author, you're a creator of many kinds. When you were doing this work around leadership development and around awakening people's creative capacities, how do you bring to bear these various selves of yours that work in different realms in different ways?
I bring every single thread of who I am with me, Eric, and I'm really blessed to be able to do that. I find that the quickest way to get people out of their heads and into their hearts and into what really matters to them is through the arts. So I use poetry to engage individuals and teams. I use singing sometimes, not always in the workplace, because sometimes people don't want to go there. Sometimes we use visual art. So if we're doing a creative visioning session for strategic work, for example, I may have them work with metaphors. I may have them work with visual images from magazines. I may have them draw or color. And it gets them out of their left brain and into their right brain and into a very creative spot. So those are some of the ways that I use my creativity.
You said sometimes people don't want to go there,
right.
And I think that's symptomatic of a larger thing, particularly if you're working in corporate America or with people in large institutions, is that there is usually a culture of not wanting to go there. And I'm wondering how you crack that, how in the first place you even make it safe to talk about creativity, let alone do some exercises or practices that instantiate it.
I try to follow my client's lead, first of all. I don't impose my creativity from the outside. So, for example, a team of medical practitioners called and asked me to come and work with them. I can't name the client, but it's a huge medical center emergency room. Administrator called me and said, Gloria, we need you to come and help us kind of get unstuck. You know, the doctors aren't talking to the nurses aren't talking to the aides, the night staff won't talk to the day staff, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I listened to the administrator, I thought, there's never one single thing in the workplace. There's always multiple things. And when I began to engage with this person and then with the team, what I found out was that people were not talking to each other because they were so busy. They felt overwhelmed, they felt stressed, they felt burnt out, and they felt underappreciated. And so my work with them was really about all of those things. And the way that I engaged them was really to say, first of all, I got their attention. I said, you know what? I wouldn't want to be a patient coming in on a gurney into this ER because I would be afraid that I wouldn't get the kind of care that I needed. Well, that got their attention, okay? And so the first, like I said, the first thing was to just hold up a placard, a mirror, so that they could take a look at themselves, a reflection of what I saw. And then I began to ask them questions like, so why did you choose the medical profession to begin with? Why did you become a physician or a nurse or an aide or an orderly? And we got to packing and unpeeling the layers of all of that stress and all of that distress and all of the havoc that can come with working in that kind of very stressful, crisis-driven situation. And as we began to peel back the layers, people began to fall in love again with their first love the medical profession. They got in touch with their reasons for wanting to be a healer, wanting to be in that kind of profession. I read poetry. They read poetry. We played music, and they got to a place where they could cross the bridge away from all of this day-to-day rush, crisis-driven environment to this place over here where they could just sit back and say, and reconnect with their passion. When they could reconnect with their passion, they found themselves very able to reconnect with their coworkers.
Mm-hmm. When we're facing a similar issue and challenge in public education right now, which is how to talk about and indeed inject more creativity into education, while at the same time making people recognize that this is not just some kind of diversion from the stuff that needs to be done. This is not just some frill or luxury. How do you, again, with the resistance that so many individuals and institutions will have, even as you say, you follow the client's lead and what their need is. At some point, I would imagine, with many clients, you hit a wall that says, I'm not comfortable going there, or using art or poetry or things like this to express these things. Don't feel like they're measurable. They don't feel like they're data driven. They don't feel like they're about the kinds of things that I'm held accountable for. How in the first place do you even shift the mindset that they are even willing to talk about their original purposes, why they came to this profession, why? How do you even get them there and do that initial opening?
One of the questions I ask my clients is, what keeps you awake at night? And that tends to get them out of their head again and into their heart. And if I can get to that question and have them engage with me at that level, then the conversation becomes real.
Yeah. I want to talk a bit about your book, Legacy Living. Tell me about this book and about the covenants that are embedded in it. And I mean, obviously, when you're working with clients and having conversations like these about what it was that originally drew them to this passion and to this sense of purpose, you can see how that connects very directly with a sense of legacy. But how, again, do you enable people to even think in terms of legacy and what kind of legacy that they want to leave?
That's a great question. Well, the book I wrote because I had to. Writers write because they have to. And this was material, Eric, that had just been rolling around in me for really all of my life. And I think I had a lot of threads of this in my work. I have had a lot of threads of what's in my book and my work for years, being unconsciously competent about what I write about. So 4 or 5 years ago, I began writing, just writing, and I wasn't quite clear what I was writing. But I knew that it had to take shape, had to take form, and what came out was this thing called Legacy Living. I actually thought I was writing a leadership book at the time, and when I presented the idea to the publisher who published my book, he said, "Gloria, this is not a book about leadership. This is a book that's much broader than leadership. It really is about how to be a creative and a good human being." And I said, "Oh." And it hadn't occurred to me that my scope was much broader. So the covenants are really all about character. They're really all about values, what forms us, what shapes us, what drives us. And the covenants that I cover in this book are 6. I cover gratitude, faith, vision, love, integrity, and legacy. And underneath those 6 covenants, the matrix that kind of guides them all is this notion of action, creative action. The fundamental questions, I think, Eric, are no different today than they were thousands of years ago, and that the questions for me reside around, what do I want to create as a human being? What do I want to make happen in my short lifetime? For whom? And what do I want to leave as a lasting legacy? And in our culture, we tend to think about legacy as something that sort of materializes after you die. And that's true. Mm-hmm. What is also true is that legacy is a process, and we're always in the process of creating our legacy, moment by moment, day by day. Every breath we take, every word we say, every moment we spend with another human being, we're creating our legacy. And the purpose of my book is really to help people be conscious and intentional about what they're doing anyway, and why not make positive choices instead of ones that are unconscious or negative or have an unkind impact on another human being.
You've come to this work not only because you have these many strands of your current life, author, poet, musician, whatever it may be, consultant, but because you yourself are I suppose we all are, but you yourself are a particularly mindful beneficiary of legacy. And one of the amazing stories that is told both in this book and I think in many of the ways you work in the world is the story of how a fellow named William Faulkner shaped your family's life. Tell me that story.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. This story actually used to be a private family story, and I didn't realize how important it was to tell the story until about 10 years ago. William Faulkner was my father's benefactor. He paid for my dad to go to college. And the story is that my dad had two dreams when he was a little boy, growing up in the 30s, in the 1930s in the rural South. One of his dreams was to live in a house with running water, which was a big, audacious dream for a little black boy at that time. His second dream was to go to college, and this was a big dream for him. It was a big dream for his family. He was not encouraged by his parents. He was not encouraged by anybody around him, but he held on to his dream. He held on to both dreams. And as a young man, he, still living in Oxford, Mississippi, he worked as a janitor at the University of Mississippi. We call it Ole Miss. And my dad would talk to anybody about his dream of going to college. I mean, he talked to the students, he talked to the professors, and so on. And this was unheard of. But somebody told somebody who told somebody about my dad's dream and about my dad and about his determination. Someone put him in touch with the dean of the college, named Dr. Love, Dean Love. And Dr. Love talked to my dad. He saw, the fire in his belly. He saw his determination. He saw his drive, his intelligence, his vision, and put my dad in touch with William Faulkner. And in those days, you went over to somebody's house. You didn't pick up the phone, and so my dad met Mr. Faulkner, and Mr. Faulkner was very impressed with meeting my father and hearing about his dream, and said, "I wanna help you go and fulfill your dream, Mr. McEwen." So he paid for my dad to attend Alcorn A&M College. He arranged for clothing for my family and for my father so that he wouldn't have to work while he was going to school, and just tried to make it as easy as possible so that he wouldn't be distracted by other things and he could concentrate on his studies. And he gave the money with no strings attached. He just said, "Pass it on and give somebody else a blessing along the way," which is what my dad lived his life doing.
How did your dad pass it on as time went by?
My dad, well, in my family, I have 4 sisters, and in my house, it wasn't a matter of if we were going to college, it was which one, so we didn't have a choice. My dad talked everybody he could talk into either completing their high school diploma or going to college or going to grad school. In some cases, he financially helped people. We were not by any means middle class, let alone wealthy. But he helped whomever he could along the way, either by talking, encouragement, or in some kind of financial way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I don't know if you were old enough at the time that William Faulkner was involved in your dad's life. I don't know if you ever even met him or encountered him, but how much was his presence and that story woven into your sense of family life and identity and your own path?
I was alive. I was actually about 1 year old when my dad met Mr. Faulkner, and we would visit him when we moved north after my dad completed college. We would go back south because my extended family is still there in Oxford, Mississippi, and we would visit Mr. Faulkner until he passed away for about 10 years following my dad and his first meeting. I have one memory of actually meeting Mr. Faulkner, being on his porch and having lemonade, but it's not a clear memory. So much of what I know is story told through my family. But his gift to my family is huge. My father's vision and my mother's support of that vision is huge in my life. When I was a little girl, my mother used to say to me and my sisters, even when we were busy doing things, she'd say, "Gloria, make yourself useful," And I know lots of mothers say that, but to me, those are words of legacy. Those are words that say, be of service, be of use, look beyond yourself, don't focus on just yourself. And so all of those individuals, my parents as well as Mr. Faulkner, have played a huge role in my life and the work that I do now.
Would you say that ethic was already fairly well formed by the time you were old enough to enter adulthood and go out into the world, or do you think it more was a seed that was planted and sprouted much later, more fully for you?
I think it was already planted. Mm-hmm. I actually think it was planted before Mr. Faulkner came into my family's life. My family has had a long tradition of service, not only to others, being African and American in this culture, but also being of service beyond the family. Community is everything to African American people, and that's something that we bring over from our African ancestry. If you're my age in this country, you tend to not only have African as part of your ancestry, you also have Native American and probably some British, Irish, Scottish threads as well. And all of those cultures value the collective and community and looking beyond yourself and not just focusing on me, or the I.
Last question on the Faulkner story. You mentioned a moment ago that up until 10 years ago, this was something that was a private family story. Was there a special reason why you wanted to keep it close as a family?
There was no special reason. I think that family stories were just that. They were internal family stories. We actually didn't think very much about it, other than it was a blessing to us, and we were very grateful. It wasn't something that we would even think to talk about with other people. And it wasn't something that we just, it wasn't a bad thing necessarily. It wasn't a good thing necessarily. It was just something that happened to us, and it was private. The reason that I began talking about it was actually one of those serendipitous, synchronous events. I had met this fellow at one of my client groups, and he and I hit it off. We got to talking. He had a journalism background, was a writer, had actually worked in the South, knew the territory that I was talking about. He says, "Oh, I've been to Ole Miss, blah, 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 blah." And somehow he just began to ask me questions like a good journalist would. And we got to talking about my childhood and, just sharing things. And I told him the story, and he just looked at me. And I said, "Why are you looking at me like that?" He said, "Have you ever told this story to anybody?" And I said, "No, it's a family story. Why would I?" And I said, "I think you're probably the first person outside of my family." He said, "Gloria," he said, "do you realize the value of what you," and I said, "No." And of course, with his journalism background, he said, "This is an incredible story. You must tell it, because if you don't, somebody else will." And it just never occurred to me, Eric, beyond that conversation. But this fellow that I was talking to, his name is Conrad. He encouraged me to write about it, and I began to write about it. And the way that I initially started to write, I was just journaling, and what wanted to come out was a children's story. Go figure. You're not in charge when you're writing. And so I wrote this children's story about my father's encounter with Faulkner. And Conrad, he actually emailed me a few months ago and said, "How's it going? Is the book published?" Well, that book is still pending. I'm still looking for a publisher for it. But that was the beginning of my talking about the story. And I realized that when I began to tell this story to other people, that they were just inspired by it. Some people couldn't believe it, but most people were inspired by it. And I realized that part of my responsibility, if you will, part of my legacy is to tell the story.
Now, we were discussing before the camera started rolling also about how, it's been a long time since you've lived in Oxford, Mississippi, and you have a lot of your life spent in the North or the Northwest, and obviously such deep roots in the South. Do you see those as interwoven, or do you see them as two selves that you're always kind of negotiating and balancing?
That's a great way to ask that question. These days I see them as integrated. It wasn't always that way. For many years I felt like I was split between the North and the South. In fact, I felt kind of schizophrenic, if you will, that, part of my psyche really was born in the South, raised in the South. And even though my family left northern Mississippi when I was a young girl, 4.5 or 5 years old, my heart remained in the South. I think my soul remained in the South. As I mentioned earlier, I have a huge extended family. We would go to visit my family as often as we could from Michigan, which is where we moved to. And I would go to school with my aunts and uncles, some of whom are my age or a little bit younger, a little bit older. So I felt like I got a lot of the upbringing from that perspective, as well as the North. And for many years, I remember as a teenager, I was very angry. And so I had these like two selves, the sort of northern self and southern self. And at some point in my adulthood, I was, I'm still on the journey, but more successful at integrating those two selves.
Angry at what?
Just angry at how black people are treated and were treated in the South. I remember when I was a little girl, going into town, uptown we called it. It was like 1 square block. But we would go into the stores, and I remember the shopkeepers who were all white, or mostly white, calling my parents by their first names. And we would have to call them by Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. And even though I didn't have the language for it, in my gut, I just knew something was, not right. And it made me feel, again, as a little girl, I don't think I felt anger, but I felt something. As a teenager and as a young adult, I knew that I didn't want anybody ever to have to go through that. And those experiences shaped me. I didn't want my parents to have to be mistreated. I didn't want to be mistreated. I didn't want my sisters to be mistreated because of our color. And those early experiences stayed with me for many, many years.
How, in turn, would you say the Northwest has been shaping you?
Well, I've been here for 20 years, and I love it here. It's probably the place that I've been the longest, actually, now that I think about it. And I don't, although I love visiting the South still, in Michigan and California, my other homes, this feels like home to me. So it's shaping me in terms of having a sense of rootedness and place. I love the rain. I actually moved here for the rain, which is unusual, I suppose. But I love the weather here. I love the light, particularly at this time of year. It's very, very slant. It's oblique. It's very different. And it's a huge contrast to the other places I've lived in my life and called home. Yeah.
It's interesting. My daughter, who has grown up here, loves it for exactly the same reasons. She's sort of disappointed when it's not a rainy day.
Wow.
And her awareness of the light, just like yours. But for you to have come to that, not being a native, is even more special in a way. You said an interesting thing a moment ago when you talked about writing the Faulkner story into a children's book, and you said, when you're writing, you're not in charge. And the question I have for you, both you personally and then circling back to the work you do as a consultant, leadership development, creativity, and the rest, how do you, for yourself and for others, open up that willingness to let an inner voice begin to speak? Because I think there are a lot of folks who are watching right now who would say, you know what, when I'm writing, someone's in charge, but it ain't me, and it's just somebody who's keeping me blocked up and not able to move as much as I might want to express myself. How do you get it so that there is this automatic flow of just what is inside you?
That's a great question. Different ways, Eric. Sometimes I work outside with my hands. I'm very kinesthetic, so working in the garden, to just open my physical body. Sometimes I listen to music or hum or sing, and it just helps me get into a different state of being. Sometimes I read. Gratitude, the covenant of gratitude, is all about paying attention to who has come before you, as well as who is with you, as well as to the future. And I don't think there's any such thing as writer's block, because when I look at the shoulders that I stand on and the people who have pushed through and written books, prose, poetry, whatever, I can draw on their inspiration. Sometimes I can take a line from them and begin writing from that. Sometimes I can take a photograph and begin writing from that. I often have photos of my daughter in her element, dancing, photos of my husband conducting, he's a musician, photos of my mother and father from when they were very, very young. That's all the inspiration I need. Yeah.
It's just wonderful. Well, Gloria, the work that you do is itself really powerful and impactful, but I think what's at least as inspiring is the mindfulness that you have of everything that's flowed into your work, and it's just a real pleasure to connect with you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you, Eric.
My guest today has been Gloria Burgess. She is the principal of Jazz Incorporated. She is the author of this book, Legacy Living, and she is a creator and a guiding light extraordinaire. We've been delighted to have her here today. I'm Eric Liu. You're watching Seattle Voices. Thanks for tuning in, and watch us again.